Coming up on the stage now is a man with over 29 years of experience in the geospatial and technology industries. Working in various public and private settings, he is currently the Chief Product Officer at the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center on the UNC Asheville campus. Dave specializes in designing and building web-based graphical geospatial tools with an emphasis on incorporating user needs. In his copious free time, Dave is also a big proponent of using open source software, which matches his core beliefs of openness, transparency, and freedom. He views technology as a way to remove some of the uncertainty we face in the world. Give it up for Dave Michelson.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get this fancy AI camera working. If it's like ChatGPT, it'll probably argue with me about doing things right, but it looks like I did it right. All right, so thanks for the introduction. Chief Product Officer at NEMAC. We don't actually really use National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center. One, because that's a mouthful. And as you'll see from my what we're going to talk about today, that would probably go against everything that I would say is to use all those words. Just a quick note, there is a QR code for questions. It's here in the beginning. So I'll give you a quick chance if you want to scan that, but there's also at the end. So if you miss it, you'll get it again coming up. So a lot of you are probably already asking, what is NEMAC? So I put a slide in here that kind of shows you what NEMAC is. It's right here. But the main things I want to highlight is just to conduct user research and to develop custom applications and communicate complex science. And the rest of it, as we'll see, will kind of make a little bit more sense. The one thing I want to point out about what we do is we're a completely self-funded group. Everything we do and all of our funding comes from the work we do. So we have partners like people at NOAA, which is the National Oceanic Aeronautical organization, and they do stuff like the National Weather Service, the Climate Program Office, amongst other things. So one of the things that a chief product officer does and what we do is we do design, right? So design is a big part of even in a hackathon, right? So when you're talking about writing code and doing things, in essence, what you're doing is you're designing, right? So if I put these three things up here, because if we actually did take a vote, I would wager a bet that most of you would say it's all three, right? And it kind of is. The reality is that you can just one thing right here, which is helping people achieve their goals. If you do this one thing, the other stuff does not matter quite as much. In fact, it probably doesn't matter at all. It just adds to it. The problem that we do a lot of times in hackathons and coding, and is when we're really kind of get vested into the coding, is we make this thing, I'd like to think of them as mazes. So I'm going to use this as a metaphor throughout the rest of this talk, is that we make mazes for people to navigate when they're trying to achieve their goals. And this is exactly what we need to avoid, because this is where people will get confused, right? So I don't know how many of you recognize this. I know you're probably just starting. Maybe you've never been to the DMV, but this is like classical DMV, right? So the things I want to point out on this is 18 stations, right? 18 stations, all these people sitting down, all of them are here for one thing: to get their driver's license. Why do you need 18 stations to get to your driver's license? That's the question I ask, right? Even worse, do you see what I highlighted? Look where they put their handicap seat. It's a seat, and it's in the middle of all the other seats. Do you think anyone that's handicapped could get to that seat? This is a maze. What they did is they have an arcane system in which you have to enter in information to get your driver's license, and they force everybody who came into the DMV to adhere to that system, including the person with the disability that can't even get to the seat, right? This is the maze. This is what we need to avoid, right? When people come in, right, like this is the best design, is when you eliminate that maze. Imagine you don't even need to go into the DMV, right? That's the ultimate design. That's the best design. When we make tools and applications, if people are coming in, this is what somebody who wants to get their driver's license wants to do. They just want to come in, push a button, says, sort it all out, right? Best design of getting your driver's license possible. Sometimes we have to compromise when we're designing things. And okay, maybe you have to enter in your name and address, right? That's a little bit of information. And that's probably all they really need, right? Because really, this is the state government. They probably have all your information anyway, right? That's all they probably need to really get your driver's license, right? Just a little bit of a maze. So if I'm telling you that you need to learn about that, right? You know, what you do know is that you need to figure out what it is people are trying to do. In the DMV, it's really easy. They're coming in to figure out if they need a new driver's license, renew their driver's license, anything around getting that license, right? That's the main goal that people are doing. So you have to learn what that is. And that's true of any process, right? So for some people, like I say, this is unfortunate, but you're going to have to go outside of buildings. You're going to have to go outside of your normal comfort zones. You're going to have to sit and watch people do things in their daily lives. You're going to have to go watch people navigate the maze the DMV made, right? Or whatever other maze they're trying to interact with in their life. And you're going to have to observe people do that. And then you're going to have to interview people, and you're going to have to dig deep into understanding what they're trying to do, right? And this is where you start understanding those goals, right? And the more you can understand that, the more you're going to eliminate the mazes that we're creating them. So at NEMAC, one of the things that I do is I get involved with doing a lot of these interviews. So these interviews and usability sessions is what I'll call them. And I'm going to define that in a second. And we've done over 300 of them, right? So and this is across all of our projects. And we work with like drought.gov. We work with the Climate Program Office. We work with nonprofits like the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And we're just talking to people that they're working with to see what they're doing, to see the points in which they might be interacting with their information. So usability is probably the easiest thing. And I'm going to dive a little bit. So we're going to stay tuned to a little bit later for what we do with that. But this is basically just observing people with your products. So when you're making these tools and little things that you're making in the hackathon, I'm going to give you some techniques to do usability on it. Because when you watch people use your product, you're going to learn more about how to eliminate more of the mazes that you're putting in front of people. User interviews are just open-ended questions that are designed to uncover behaviors, needs and goals, and problems that people are having. Now, this is not problems they're having with your tool. This is just problems they're having in general. This is where you discover what are they going to the DMV for in the first place. And one thing I want to make clear is like we're never asking people what they like or what they dislike. We're not trying to understand that. We're trying to understand what they're doing in their daily lives. So understanding how to navigate the maze becomes really important. So some techniques that I'm going to talk about, and we're going to dig a little bit into science. I hope you guys are up for that. When people do anything in their lives, including when you're walking, when you're driving, when you're doing anything and you're navigating the world, including navigating websites and tools, people are scanning, right? We scan, we try to make sense, and we're trying to determine if this thing will help us. We can't possibly look at every single detail. So what the brain does perceptually is they scan it and they break it down, and they're breaking it into little chunks, trying to determine, is this thing going to help me? Is it going to help me achieve my goals? There's basically 4 patterns of scan. There's more, but these are the ones that are really important. But there's really 3, and these first 3 on the left are what we're looking for. And when you do eye tracking, these are the 3 that we see pop up all the time, right? So the F pattern is probably the one that is most common. And basically anything in the upper left quadrant is going to be where the most important pieces of information are. So this is what how people will be scanning your tools or your websites. And when they get to that final one on the right, that's that commitment stage. And that's when you know you've succeeded at getting their attention. That's when you know that the scan worked and they were able to see that it was going to help them. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into the actual science of scanning. So when people scan, there's some visual perception and some visual perception psychology that people are using. And the first one is called visual search and Gestalt principles. And these two things are kind of interacting together. Looking at the simplest part of visual search, basically the idea is you're looking for a target amongst a bunch of distractors, and the time it takes to find that target is the reaction time. The faster the reaction time, the easier it is. The longer, the harder it is. And they've done thousands of experiments around visual search, right? And when you see this red circle in these, amongst the green ones, you see it almost instantly, right? Well, when we have these other theories in visual search, there's probably a dozen, but this one to me is the one that kind of sticks out, especially when you're talking about designing websites, tools, or anything with technology. And it's called attention engagement theory, right? So the more, I'm going to have to read this because I always get it confused. As the similarities between the distractors decreases, it's getting a little less hard, and right? So you go to the bottom left, you move up to the top left, gets a little bit harder to see the red circle, not much, right? But as you go to the lower right, now the distractors start looking more and more like the target. It gets a little bit harder. And then the upper right, everything looks like each other, right? And that red circle, if you do an experiment with this, you'll see it happen every time. That just some people will see the red circle in the upper right quick, but most people will not. And that's going to be the one that's the hardest, right? So the upper right and the lower right, this is how we design most tools in the world, right? Most of the websites you encounter probably fall into those categories, but this is what we're trying to avoid as designers, right? And people creating products. We need to be thinking, how do we get it more towards the bottom left quadrant? Make sense? But visual search has an issue here, right? Because not everything can be explained by this. Because if you look at these two diagrams, right, they both have the exact same distractors with the same target, but one is organized a little bit differently, right? And it's kind of magical that suddenly the red circle just pops right up. What could be causing that? So there's another part of visual perception that talks about the organization of items. And this is the Gestalt principles, right? And the law of prognose is probably the one that's most well known. You'll see the others that are well known too, and it's the simplest form. The Gestalt psychologist, this is back in the early 1900s, so it's been around for over 100 years. They would say that this is akin to dropping oil in water, and you get the little globes of water that will form in or the oil will form in little drops, right? So that's the simplest form that the oil will take in the water. And they say that perceptually, you'll do the same. That may not be fully true, but for the most part, it is. And the types of things that we talk about in Gestalt are proximity, similarity, closure, and continuation, right? So you can see what's happening here is we have in proximity, you have 6 circles, right? With the gray, but they really look like 3 groups of 2. And then you can start seeing how the grouping works, including closure, which shows 4 circles with a square, but none of those really exist. There's not really a circle there, and there's not really a square, but you still will perceive them as being there. Then the lines on the bottom with the continuation, how the lines look like they'll kind of flow across each other, right, rather than separate shapes. All of this is really being controlled by proximity, and that's the only one where scientifically, the closer things are, the more they will look like they belong together. So I want to make sure that everyone takes everything we just talked about and understands that everything else that we'll talk about is based on those theories. So some tips, right? So let's take that and let's get some tips. But before we jump into more tips like around the perceptual part of it, is design myth. And this happens to just about everybody that we work with, is they like to talk about the general public. Other folks will say everyone's my user. I can guarantee you that neither one of those is true, right? Everyone's not your user, and the general public's not your user. Although they do exist, Your user lies within that, and they're much smaller. And the way I like to think about this is once you have done the interviews and some of the usability, you'll start seeing this common goal, right, amongst the groups. And you need to pick one, especially when you're talking hackathon, you pick one, right? Maybe two if you want to be really ambitious, but one, and just focus on doing that really well. And then that's when you're less likely to create that maze. So when we start talking about Gestalt, and we'll jump back into that now. This is with drought.gov, and this is one of our projects. So on the left side, this is how we initially had started designing. The whole group would design this page with maps, and they have tons of indexes that talk about drought, because drought's one of the most complex things in climate. There's so many different types of drought, and there's so many things that it can affect that it's incredibly complex. So in usability sessions, what we would see is we would show people these maps on the left, and we would start talking to them about, tell me what this means to you and all these other things. And they would just become overwhelmed. They couldn't tell us, even though all the information's there. So we reorganized it a little bit, like on the one on the right, and it was almost instantly they were able to navigate it and tell us what it meant, when it was updated, and all the other things that they needed to get from it. What this speaks to is starts speaking to like some of the other things you need to do. You should always be using hierarchy. Hierarchy allows us to do some of that grouping, right? So different font sizes, different things, so that you can allow them to get separated together. Another part, and this is related, is overly precise data is not necessary 99.9999999% of the time, right? And you can see this, right? So you recognize this number, right? I can guarantee you that if I put 3.14, you would know that it was still pi, right? In fact, I bet you if you went out and did usability and you gave them that very long number, people might not know it's pi. Then they'd be more likely to know that it was pi with 3.14, right? So think about that. They probably only needed 20% of what you thought they needed to get to the information that you wanted them to get to, right? And so this is what reducing the amount of text and of everything, not being overly precise, actually can be more, right? In fact, I would say that you probably need 20%, and then of that 20% that remains, you probably only need half of it to really effectively get people to understand what they're looking for. Next part is more white space. White space, right? We talked about proximity. When you use white space, you're forcing proximity. You're forcing people to group things together. Bigger fonts, same thing. The best thing about bigger fonts is everybody wants to over-explain. When you use bigger fonts, they have no choice but to not over-explain. You should never be using anything above like an 18 point font size, right? 16 maybe. But once you go below that, people are not going to be able to read it, and it's going to start blending together, and they're going to become overwhelmed. And that means if you have to reduce the font size to fit stuff, that's the first clue that you're over-explaining. Vision issues, right? So along with bigger fonts, you can help people with vision issues, right? 20 to 30% of the people have vision issues, right? Don't be the chair in the middle of the DMV. This is really important too. And along with vision issues is colorblindness. Around 8 to 10% of the people in the world have some kind of colorblind issue. And this is especially true of reds and greens, right? That's number one colorblind problem. So never put them together. Reorganization of everything, like that first example with drought, we didn't do anything different. We didn't remove any information. We just reorganized it. And these two maps, so we work with the National Forest Service, and they're concerned about just forest disturbance. So we develop all these forest disturbance tools for them. The one on the left is predated me, and this has over 7,000 data layers, right? So imagine trying to navigate 7,000 data layers to understand forest disturbance, right? So the reality is that most of these 7,000 layers are date-dependent layers, right? There's really only 5 disturbance patterns that they're looking at. So if they're date dependent, we reorganize them on the right side to be date dependent. So basically, you look at one of those 5 topics, you plug in your start date, your end date, and press play. It appears that there's 5 layers instead of 7,000. And that's the idea, is you reorganize it based on the user goals, right? Because what we were noticing was the scientists and all of their users would come into this complex menu system of 7,000 layers, and they'd have to individually click layers on and off based on the date. And it would take them, 10, 15 minutes to do 3 or 4 days. That's not very efficient, right? So some of our observations, and I think the one thing I want to make clear is this may not be your users, but we work with a lot of folks doing climate, environmental data and weather data. So I think for some of the stuff you might be talking about, even in science, I think this would probably carry over, but I don't want to say that it will. Okay, to be clear, that I would advocate to continue to talk to people that you would think are your users. But the number one behavior that we see is people are copying and pasting the information from these maps, charts, and everything else that we build into reports, presentations, proposals, newsletters, blogs, whatever, right? You should be designing for things like that. Make it really easy for them to download the image, really easy to capture the data into spreadsheets, or even better, just make it so they can just copy and paste directly. They're doing this because they usually have a story or narrative they're trying to tell, right? In the case of like a proposal, it could be a grant proposal. They're trying to say this project is going to be this good for this reason, right? They're looking to do that. So we're always gearing all of our information so that they can easily tell that story. We're not telling the story for them. We're just gearing it so they can do that storytelling. The number one problem they're having is just questioning if they at any point question their ability to explain your data or information, they will not use it. Right. So if they have to read if they have to read a whole lot of text, they're going to give up right away. If there's a lot of jargon, they're going to give up right away, right? That's another part, is no jargon, right? And no jargon, and jargon is anything someone who is your user can't understand. So you have to talk to them to find out what that is. Another thing I see people doing all the time is they're trying to compare 2 places. And this is not like a direct comparison. This is more, think of the idea of like, where do I rank compared to another place like me, right? Right. So if you're here in Morganton, what are other places like Morganton that you want to see how they compare to, right? That's what people are trying to end up doing with this data and this information. Another thing I want to bring up is empty state. This is really important. When people see empty state, and what this means is all of these maps have no data on them. It's not that the data doesn't exist. It's just for these particular locations, except for one of them, there is no data. But what happens is people encounter this and they think it's broken. They think the data hasn't loaded. So you'll see them in usability sessions refreshing over and over again. And you have to ask, what's going on? Tell me what you're thinking. And they're like, well, it looks like it's broken and it didn't load, right? So this will happen in data tables too. So always be thinking about empty state. How do you tell people that this is supposed to be true or not? So some of the ways to combat empty state, one thing to add with maps, if the data is on the periphery of the map, they'll still view it as there's no data on the map. So it gets a little tricky to think about. But some things to do is preload the data, make sure that there's something in there, especially if it's a map. If it's a data table, tell them there's no data. Add spinners all the time. So if it's going to load with no data, that spinner is an indication and feedback that something happened, even if it's a fake spinner, right? So there was a usability session on a tool we were building, and we were loading the data instantaneously, and it kept appending to the bottom. And I was seeing that same pattern where people were refreshing. And they said, I think it's broken. It's just not loading. It's taking a really long time. It was happening instantaneously. So we added a fake spinner. It actually added half a second to the tool, right? And when we went out and tested it, the first reaction was like, oh my gosh, that's so fast. How did you guys do this, right? And this happened over and over again. So we actually added time, but people thought it was faster, right? So it's just perception. In the case of a map, like what we did, if you see this neutral conditions, this was the no data empty state condition, right? We actually emphasize that more to show people that, hey, there is going to be times when there is nothing there, right? So that it's not broken. Keeping charts simple, that's super important. These are two things that we've worked on. For me, the left one is much simpler than the one on the right side, right? I think it's a little too complex on the right side still. And I also think that we still have too precise of data for that data set. So my ultimate tip, you can ignore everything I just said. If you can remember this one slide right here. Do not ask people what they want. They don't actually know what they want. Ask them what they do, right? And then do usability tests to find out if your site, tool, or whatever you're building them actually can help them do it. When you do that, this is what I see every time, is that you'll start seeing increased page views. You'll see longer page views. You'll see less times when people come to your tool site or whatever, where they're doing nothing and they're just leaving, right? And these things are the things we want to do. This is how we know we're getting closer to that committed pattern, right? Where people are actually interested in using your tool, right? Ultimately, you're building these things that you're building on hackathons is because you want people to use it. You want to make a difference. And this is the kind of way to get to that. So one of the great tools that I use, right? And I've told you about users and I told you about you need to talk to your users, but guerrilla usability is a little bit different, right? So when you first build things, especially like at hackathons, you're going to have usability issues. There's just no way around it. So guerrilla usability, this is a great tool. I've used this all the time. And the idea here is to just get a general feel for what usability is. You give somebody a scenario to act out, the very thing that you think they should be doing. And then you ask them to act that scenario out on your tool. They're supposed to narrate out loud, so you're asking them to talk what they're thinking out loud. A little unnatural, but when you hear them do this the first couple times, it's amazing what you'll learn. You watch, you listen, and you do not help them, right? This is the hardest thing. Do not help them. Let them kind of get stuck and not figure out where they're at. You take notes and record it, and you follow up with open-ended questions. You can do this with any human, right? So you have a bunch of people in the room where you're doing the hackathon with. You can go to the other teams and you can have them do usability. That's a guerrilla usability session, right? Any of the teachers here, you can ask them to do it. Any of the volunteers, ask them to do it. You can even do it remotely. So you can call up family, friends. You can get them on a Zoom or a Google Meet or whatever you want and have them do it. FaceTime, whatever. How many people? This is amazing. 3 to 5 people. When you get to 5 people, you'll find 80% of the usability. And then you're at the top of that curve. You no longer need to do it. Once you hit those 5 people, and with that single scenario, and you'll see it every time, it'll become very clear what you need to change. You can do this, like I said, you can do this anywhere. It doesn't matter. I've done it in coffee shops. I've done it in coffee shops and gotten a plate of cookies and offer people cookies, right? Because that's one thing you need to pay them. Cookies are payment because cookies are awesome. So what does this look like? So the basic idea here is you do a little introduction. You create 2, 3 tasks at most. You don't want to overburden anybody. And the tasks are pretty simple. So we were building an emergency action plan for the University of for UNC Asheville, right? And people who were managing these emergency action plans had to log in and then find their emergency action plan and then update it. So that's what we asked them to do. That's the usability session, is log in, update your contact information, and we would just watch them do that. And when they couldn't do things, we would then go try to fix that and then do it again until they could. Very easily, under a minute. So that's one thing, is you always want to decide before what failure looks like and what success looks like, so there's no argument about it later. So last tips with this is you're always using open-ended questions. And what does that look like, right? When somebody says, what does this mean? You don't tell them, you say, what do you think it means? Right. So you turn it right back at them. I call this um, therapy without the tears. Right. So that's the idea is just think about how a therapist will talk to you, and when they said, well, what's supposed to happen here? And you go, what did you expect to happen here? Right. And the even better is do things like when you see people struggle to say, tell me more about, and then you kind of trail off, right? And the idea is people will fill the space. When you take notes too, the same thing happens is when you're taking notes, and this is really important, is take as many notes as you can because taking notes makes you be quiet. It makes you less likely to help. And people will always fill that blank space up when you're being quiet and taking notes. Record it, the sessions. When you record, always ask for consent. That's really important. And always pay them. Cookies can be payment, donuts can be payment, anything can be payment. T-shirts, whatever. You don't have to give them money, although that helps. Tips. So like after one, debrief with the team, summarize, list the top 3 things that you saw. And after you do a whole round of it, like these 3 to 5, then you can list all the issues. It'll be very clear. I promise you it'll be very clear what the fixes are. Right. And then prioritize them, all those fixes, and then repeat this over and over again. As many times as you can. There's no magic number to the number of times. Like I would say forever, because you always will have usability issues. There's a time at which I'll call it that you get to this point where you get to the whack-a-mole stage, is that you fix one and another one pops up. Right. And then you're probably in a good spot, but you probably haven't figured out user goals yet. That's usually the good indication. Whole bunch of resources. I'll make these slides available. They're going to be available after it, so you can go to it. It gives you directions on how to do it. All the documentation about how to create your own usability script will be there. And of course, that's the end. So slides and questions are available. And I want to throw out there too, like one thing we can do before we do questions or after questions, and this is really fun. I do this quite a bit, is we can do a live usability right here. So we can test a tool that I have, or if you guys have stuff that you've been doing during the hackathon and you want to do a usability session on that right now, we can do guerrilla usability on it. And I've done this many times. I did this for a group building a climate tool where they simulate how to do climate negotiations for the world, right? And when they did this, I knew their tool had like lots of usability issues because they were showing it to me. So what we did is we brought them into the session when I did a guerrilla usability session, brought them in, and they were like, their eyes went so big and they were like, oh my gosh, we see everything we need to do now. And it went from like no one using their tool to like everybody in the world using their tool. And they bring this to like all the big climate negotiations that they have where all the countries gather and everybody's talking about it. They bring this tool to that now and everybody uses it. I didn't do anything. I just showed them how to do guerrilla usability. So I'll leave that up to you guys. We can take questions or jump into that. I'll let you decide.
We do got some questions from online in Durham. Our first question being, what advice would you give to us in our final day of the hackathon to polish up the user experience of our projects?
So it's simple, like guerrilla usability. That would be the first thing I would do. The polish up, I can tell you like little things to polish up, but I would need to see it. But more than anything, if you just run one usability session on it with 3 to 5 people, the polish you'll see there will help you more than anything I can tell you, right? And until you do it and see it, it's hard to explain. But I can guarantee you, it not only will it make the things you're building better, but it'll make you guys better developers too, right? It's so key. Some of the developers that I've worked with when we do this, they start with, oh, I don't need to do usability, I understand it, to like, we need to do more, right? How do we do more?
The next question we got is, what is one of the best examples you've seen of impactfully presenting climate data?
I get asked this question all the time. I should have like a prepared answer, but I don't. And I think this is because I don't think we've really figured that out yet, right? So when you talk about climate data, the data is so complex, right? And then it's also problematic in that climate is long term, right? And humans aren't designed to perceive long term implications, right? That we're not designed to do that. So we're trying to help people do that. Like I don't know if there is one. I think we still are on the work of how do we do that, right? So for us, what we're doing is at NEMAC, we're much more about decision making. So what we're trying to do is that copying and pasting that behavior that of helping people tell their story. That's where I would start, right? And I do not think we're doing a good enough job at that. So unfortunately, I don't have the best answer other than this is exactly what we're working on and trying to solve is things like that.
Uh, Another question we have is, what would you deem are the best open source GIS resources?
Open source. Yeah. So the best open source GIS resources. So any of the data portals are going to be really good. I don't have any particular one, but if you're talking about software, I don't know which one, if it's going to be software or data that the question's pertaining to, but software, um, personally, I use a lot of QGIS open source. GeoPandas is great and PostGIS is great. Those are like probably the three mainstays that I go to for open source geospatial data or, doing geospatial work.
And last question, where should we focus our user experience efforts when creating a quick proof of concept in 36 hours?
Yeah, so user interviews are probably more long term, so that's probably unrealistic in a hackathon, but you can still do it because you can still go out and really quickly even just search LinkedIn and find people that fit that target user group and try to see if you can get their attention and get them to engage. But if you can't do that, then I would say it's always going to be guerrilla usability. You can find out so much information in guerrilla usability that you can't find out any other way. That especially in a hackathon, that you have to be doing that in a hackathon. I can't emphasize that enough. So it might be really good to like do a usability session on something here.
Cool. That's all the questions we have here. So give a round of applause for Mr. Michelson.